again, welcome to Law Stories. How many of you have been to a Law Stories event before? Thank you for coming back. This is just one of the best things there is. I don't know who in the law department says, you know what we ought to have around here? A storytelling program. But I'll tell you, it's catching, you know. We met with the students who will present today, and at least one of them said, you know, I heard about this from the instructor of the storytelling class at my law school. And so this kind of thing is spreading. We're so very, very happy to see it do so. We want to welcome, I introduced you to Jeff a minute ago. Jeff and Jenna and others are here from LSAC. We're very, very happy to have them with us. They're recording and they deserve your very warmest. And we'll get it now. My name is Sam Payne, and it's been a great pleasure for me to be involved in Law Stories these 2 years, right? I am a storyteller by profession, and I do a radio show that broadcasts daily from BYU Radio here. And we've had really a magical day bringing these stories over into the studios of BYU Radio and recording them, archiving them. It's my very, very favorite thing to do. I have a producer over there and an engineer who just, you know, kind of yawning, come into work for just a regular old day. And then we bring these beautiful, inspiring, insightful personal stories into the studio. And they walk out, my producer and my engineer, kind of having had their minds blown. And you guys watched it happen today as they were affected by the great stories that we will hear tonight. Over there at BYU Broadcasting, one of the things that I've had the great pleasure of doing is running for several years a music and interview program. And to that music and interview program have come a lot of great musicians, and they come in and they play music and they talk to us. Not too long ago, we had wonderful pianist Scott Holden, faculty member here at Brigham Young University, and the wonderful baritone Robert Brandt come in to sing songs by World War I composers. And they carried us away with songs with songs about this shining generation that went to war, and so many of them didn't come back. They came in and they sang songs like "The lads in their hundreds, the lads in their hundreds to Ludlow come in for the fair. There's men from the barn and the forge and the mill and the fold. The lads for the girls and the lads for the liquor are there, and there with the rest are the lads that will never be old." And our hearts were turned to that shining generation, and that's the phrase that we used, that shining generation. And as we got to know these students today and heard their stories, that phrase is the phrase that came back to me. This shining generation that with the law in their hands goes forward with idealism and bravery and resolve and dissatisfaction with the status quo to really genuinely change the world. The stories that you'll hear from them tonight are filled with all of those things. I asked people before we started today, just people in my circle, for words associated with their feelings about attorneys. And you can only imagine some of the words that I got. I got cutthroat, and I got mercenary, and I got hard-nosed, and I got all of these words. And as we have worked with these stories today, the words that have come to mind are compassion and hope and introspection. And you're going to see all of that on display. We want to start by bringing to the stage Ruben Felix. Ruben Felix, you can see his favorite quote up on the board: "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others," a quote from Nelson Mandela. And as we invited all of the students in our workshop this morning to make a brief statement about why they tell the stories that they tell, Ruben said, "I tell to invite myself as well as others to reflect, perceive the world a little more clearly and universally, and to connect with others." His name, I just learned, means fortunate son. Fortunate son, Ruben Felix.
The title of my story is "This Is Not Just My Story." I was raised in a small agricultural town. In a house located in the bosom of gang territory, some of my favorite childhood movies were Mi Vida Loca, Blood In, Blood Out, and American Me, films that depict the life Chicanos face in neighborhoods laden with gang violence. I would often recreate scenes from these movies, pretending I was running away from cops and dodging bullets. As a child, I argued with everyone. People joked that I would make a good lawyer. I went along with it, but it wasn't my dream. I never imagined arguing before a judge or winning over a jury. No, I dreamed of money, because we had very little of it. I never thought of the drudgery of the profession, or how hard it would be for someone like me, from a town like mine, to get a law degree. My first encounter with the law was at age 4, when I unintentionally cracked the windshield of a passing car. From then on, I only got into more trouble. My childhood was full of law-breaking behavior. Fortunately for me, the law rarely caught me. I eventually outgrew that behavior, as most kids do, but some of my friends were not as lucky. They got caught up in a system that only further criminalized them. As a young boy, I helped my dad in his night job. We worked the entire summer, but my dad was never paid. With no lawyers in our network and no money to pay for legal counsel, we simply had to accept it and move on. In my late teens, my neighbor Sleepy was shot. I watched his bullet-pierced torso and blank pale face as he struggled for air. He survived, but no one was held accountable. Bayo's story ended in tragedy. He was also shot. As he fought for his life, the police declared the scene unsafe, prohibiting paramedics from performing life-saving services. My friend died on the way to the hospital. I often wonder if the outcome would have been different had the police allowed the paramedics to perform the job on arrival. When I was a young adult, my sister was forcibly taken by police officers from our home shortly after giving birth. She was accused of having a cell phone her boyfriend had allegedly stolen. My sister, with no priors, was treated like a common criminal. I felt powerless, which led to anger for the injustice I perceived. On another occasion, my brother had too much to drink and was arguing with the mother of his child. When the cops arrived, my brother quickly regained his cool. Yet they grabbed him and began pushing him towards the street. My brother leaned against them, and chaos ensued. My mom tried to help, but she was pushed to the ground. Somehow, I got to my brother before they tackled us both to the pavement. "I got you," I told my brother, with our faces pressed together and 4 officers piled on my back. My brother was taken in. He was arrested, taken in, and returned nursing a busted ankle. These experiences and others like them conjured within me a resentment for the law. Yet my resentment did not fix anything. Only upon reflection did I realize my need to understand the law. Maybe the law could help somebody like me. Maybe I could help change the law. Perhaps I should be a lawyer after all. For the first time in my life, I had purpose, and over the next 6 years, I clawed my way into law school. During a recent trip back home, my brother and I cruised the neighborhood. My brother made sure that everybody knew that I was on my way to becoming a lawyer. Many of our friends' comments reflected the pessimism towards the law. Yet they all encouraged me. "Échale ganas. Hurry up, I need your services. I hope you get into politics someday." Looking back, I feel proud to have made it this far, but I also feel guilty. Why am I the one here? I think back to the people that I grew up with, who are just as capable as me. We are not very different, yet we live in separate worlds. It was not my life choices alone that afforded me this opportunity. I, too, made many mistakes. That is when I realized that my story does not exist alone, but rather exists only because and in the context of the stories of others. We are all part of an all-encompassing narrative, one that promises deliverance. On the one hand, deliverance from the servitude of working for somebody else's dream and the envy of not being able to pursue our own. And on the other hand, deliverance from the idea that we are self-made, prosper according to our own genius, and the others are less deserving. This is a story of law, order, inalienable rights, and the pursuit of happiness declared by our founding fathers. It is a story that has yet to come to fruition. My friends are not free. And because of that, I am not free. True freedom comes all or nothing, and is only achieved as we all are individually enabled to realize our highest potential, an Everest that we can never reach by our own merits or devices. And if this is true, then bondage is potential constrained, unachieved because of selfishness, indifference, and lack of self-awareness. Thus, we are bound to a story of our own design, where the more we individually want, the less we will ultimately become. And where the potential of all falls short, when the potential of the one is not realized. This is a story of freedom. But this is not just my story. This is our story. Will we choose to be free?
Ruben Felix, ladies and gentlemen. I chatted with Ruben for just a moment before we began, and I asked him how his afternoon was. We've spent much of the day together, right? We spent some morning together, we spent some afternoon together, and then people separated to get some food and do what they needed to do before we gathered this afternoon. And Ruben described for me how he had gone home and got the kids something to eat and then turned right back around and came here to. It put me in mind of the dedication of the law student, right? The dedication that every one of these people shows every day, making it through just the vicissitudes of everyday life and still forging ahead to make the difference that they want to make in the world. What a blessing it is to be here. And up next, we want to bring to the stage this person whose personal mantra is take life seriously, but not yourself. I told her that I think that her name would be a terrific band name. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Cat Mail.
All right. The name of my story is Born Yesterday. Stepping out from the fluorescent lighting of the Oaks Correctional Facility and into the orange Michigan autumn outside, I felt righteous. Earlier that day, my professor, my clinic partner, and I had endured 3 hours of driving the flat Midwestern highway to Oaks. As part of the appellate defense clinic, we had conducted an interview with my client, Mr. Peters. He's serving a 40-year sentence for shooting a .38 at a car. But now I knew, after speaking with him, that his conviction was madness. Mr. Peters is innocent. His trial attorney had utterly failed to tell his side of the story, and my hands were itching to write his appeal. The prison is in a one-street town with a tiny Mexican restaurant, which was our first stop before hitting the long road back to Ann Arbor. My mind was so full of Mr. Peters' story, so full of believing him, that I couldn't read the menu and picked my lunch at random. And then, our food finally in front of us, I listened in confused silence as my companions began discussing why they thought Mr. Peters was lying. Did you know that the word gullible is not in the dictionary? Of course it's in the dictionary. Merriam-Webster defines it as easily duped or cheated. I have always been easily duped or cheated. My best friend still often tells me to look under there because she knows that I'm going to respond underwear. Countless times I've looked at the ceiling to see if the word gullible is actually written there. And last October, I'd spent 4 hours captivated by an inmate's tale, which I was now being told was fantasy. Listening to my companions convincingly rehash the dubious parts of Mr. Peters' story between bites of rice and beans, I felt like I'd again looked up to see whether the word gullible was written on the ceiling, only to find out I was actually outside. Secretly, I still thought and think that he was innocent. You should know that I'm terribly indecisive about my career. By the time I graduate law school, my resume will include substantive work in defense, prosecution, a firm, 2 judicial internships, 1 appellate and 1 trial, and nonprofit education law consulting. A little while after meeting with Mr. Peters, prosecution caught my eye, and I soon applied to intern at my state attorney general's office and interviewed over Thanksgiving break. My interviewer was a gregarious assistant attorney general, just the sort of Southern, proudly conservative person I'd expected given what I knew about the office. He asked me why, despite my participation in a defense clinic and other off-brand resume items, I was interested in prosecution. And I said something non-committal about enjoying my criminal law class. As he replied, a smile grew on his face, and he said, "Yeah, and as crim law goes, it's nice to be on the side of the angels." In response, I smiled. I actually believed this shockingly simplistic statement. At least I believed it long enough to interview convincingly, receive an internship offer, and accept it. The whole process of committing myself to the assistant attorney general's ideology took about 45 minutes. But driving home from the interview, I began thinking about Mr. Peters and the prosecutors who convicted him. They too thought that they were on the side of the angels when they falsely convicted Mr. Peters. That was the story they'd been told and that they'd believed. And I thought you'd have to be awfully gullible to believe that story. But I'm awfully gullible, and so I had just believed it for about 45 minutes. During that car ride, I suddenly stopped thinking about my gullibility as a simple character flaw and realized it's a complex problem for someone 2 years into law school. Surely gullibility is a weakness in a profession where there are always competing narratives and you have to choose one side to argue for. For someone who believes everything, choosing is an awfully daunting task. I envisioned myself 10 years in the future as a prosecutor, nodding my head as the defendant gives their testimony from the stand. And then I thought about myself as a defense attorney listening to the prosecutor's opening statement about the importance of rule of law and turning to my client and whispering, "You know, he has a point." I spent the late fall in a paralysis of indecision. I had to write Mr. Peters' appeal for the clinic, but I felt contaminated by my brush with the prosecutor's office. My thoughts lacked gravity, hovering between defense and my internship at the prosecutor's office and dropping out. The due date loomed. I consulted my notes from our October jailhouse visit, and they helped. Mr. Peters, in that meeting, had revealed his frustration that at trial, his side of the story was not told. There was no competing narrative for the jury to fall for, the gullible ones or the skeptics. I realized that, had I been a juror, I would have voted guilty without anywhere else to place my easily won trust. Writing the brief, I tapped into that embarrassing truth, and I wrote about the injustice of having only one side of the story told. I wrote the story that I had fallen for back in October. Months have now passed since I submitted that brief. Just a few weeks ago, I heard from my clinic supervisor. Mr. Peters recently read the brief, and he told her he was really, really pleased. She said that whether or not the judge believes his story, it means a lot to him that someone had told it his way. I have no clue who my clients are going to be one day, but when they tell me that gullible is written on the ceiling, I'm going to look up without hesitation, and I'm not going to feel so bad about it. Thank you.
Cat Mail, ladies and gentlemen. Cat was named, and unless I'm being gullible, and this isn't even true, but I think it is true, Cat was named for the character in Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. Yes? Is that right? The Shrew. Yeah. Yeah, this is, parents with a sense of humor. It's good. It's good. The cat, I alluded to the fact earlier with Ruben that we spent some time this morning talking about the notion that's important to me as a storyteller, that not every story needs a moral, but every story needs a reason. And we invited each of these storytellers to think for just a moment of what a reason for storytelling might be, what their reason for storytelling might be. And Kat said, I want to capitalize on my natural lack of shame to tell stories that validate the embarrassing or shameful experiences of others. I want to offer relatability for the people who most need it. As she told her story, I thought about gullibility, and I thought about the famous story among my circle of friends in high school about when my friend Neil told my friend Laura that every stop sign with a white border was optional. That's kind of a two-edged sword, as we discovered several weeks later as we were driving with Laura, and it was a terrifying ride. Up next, we have a story from this person, Danyelle Mozingo, and Danyelle goes often as she goes by Danyelle, she goes by her nickname, which is Deli. And she said, you can introduce me, though, as Danyelle, because I think Deli Mozingo might just be too funny to say. It's become my very favorite thing to say, I got to tell you right now. And you can see in this photograph of her, sort of the new Danyelle Mozingo. We learned that she had just gone through the enormous life experience of having 12 inches of her hair cut off like 3 days ago, right? Yeah, so we welcome to the microphone the new Danyelle Mozingo.
Hi, everyone. My story is called Conversations with Myself, The Bravery of Simply Existing. In July 2001, law enforcement officers responded to a domestic violence call at approximately 2 a.m. They pulled into my neighborhood, a small trailer park located a few yards off the highway. I sat outside on my porch steps and I watched blue lights dance in the summer air. My father left in handcuffs. I vomited from the stress. Anxiety became an integral part of my existence at a young age. I struggled to understand the world around me, a world where I went hungry and my parents hit each other and misery followed me. I blamed myself for these things. As I grew older, I realized that my parents suffered from opioid addiction and untreated mental illness. I also came to realize that their struggle with addiction was due in part to their repeated incarceration without adequate substance abuse treatment. But on this night in 2001, I didn't know what to make of my life. I was just 4 years old. 9 years later, I blew out my candles after a chorus of voices saying happy birthday. I sat down to open my presents, and I was surrounded by family and a few friends. A knock at the door interrupted our festivities, and an officer presented a warrant for my father's arrest. After that day, nothing surprised me anymore. I became so accustomed to correctional facilities that it felt like I was in prison too. What was once traumatizing became mundane. The razor wire fences and plexiglass visiting booths, they didn't really faze me anymore. I walked across the prison yard unfeeling as guards aimed their rifles at me from the tower above. My heart was cold. My father's name is inmate 0295413. He's been in and out of prison since he was 26 years old. Despite his violent past, he's a sensitive man, and he likes U.S. history and cats and wearing cozy sweaters. He has my name tattooed over his heart. He was once my best friend. My mother's name is inmate 0539483. I've known her my whole life, but I didn't meet her until I was 14 years old, and that's when I first saw her sober. Though she's only 50 years old, she has false teeth from years of drug abuse. She struggles with severe depression, and she uses a walker as she's now in need of a hip replacement. She calls me from from News Correctional Institution once a week to talk about nothing. We hardly know each other anymore, but we never knew each other to begin with. She asked me often about how my job is going, a court advocate position at a local domestic violence center. How do I tell my mother that every victim that walks through the door reminds me of her? I can't. Most of the clients that I encounter distrust the legal process, and rightfully so. Some are afraid to report their abuse because their police have doubted their allegations in the past. Others are afraid that their testimony will be discredited because they're addicted to drugs. How do I tell these women in good faith to trust the legal system when I feel like I'm a victim of it myself? I can't. My work in victims advocacy unveils the oppression shared between my clients and me, a commonality that I've actively ignored in the past merely for the sake of just getting by. I sit across from them in a tailored pantsuit, and I look the part of a middle-class civil servant, out of touch but with good intentions. My clients look very different from me, and though they don't know it, we're the same. Though we are strangers, we know each other well. My existence in this field leaves me feeling like a walking contradiction. Does a pursuit of a legal career imply an inherent trust that I so vehemently deny? Perhaps not. Perhaps the most important trust is not given to the institutions or the system, but to the people within. Life is filled with many beautiful contradictions. I turn to a system which has taken power from me in order to restore the power that's been taken from others. It is a privilege to be trusted with a client's well-being and trauma in her most powerless state. It is a privilege to tell a client that you understand what they're going through and actually mean it. If there's even a small possibility that my work can protect others, the re-victimization that I suffer is a cost that is both negligible and necessary. Zealous advocacy is born of zealous empathy. What are we to do when the system vital to our protection contributes to our oppression? It's hard to say. And I suppose the answer is different for everyone. For me, the answer is to put roots down in the source of the oppression itself and defiantly make space for myself and others who have felt excluded from its protection. I'm committed to actively engaging with unspeakable trauma so that others may navigate the system with greater ease. To choose otherwise would be an injustice.
Danyelle Mozingo, ladies and gentlemen. She, as we were asking students to think on their reason for storytelling, Danyelle said, "I'm telling my story to show up for myself, validate my experience, and give myself a platform. By telling my story, I'm saying my story is important, and you're going to hear it whether you want to or not." And she told us a story about going to the dentist. And into the dentist she went, where she was crying, big tears rolling down her face, because she always cries when she goes to the dentist or the doctor because she's so frightened. And the person who was about to perform the procedure on her took her by the hand and said, "Listen, you are the bravest person in the building because you're crying from fear and you showed up anyway," right? And what a thing to say. Up next, we're going to hear from Brianna Bell. And her favorite quote is such a lovely one, I think. "Be a lamp or a lifeboat or a ladder. Help someone's soul heal. Walk out of your house like a shepherd." Welcome her to the microphone, ladies and gentlemen, Brianna Bell.
I want to say thank you to BYU. It's such a powerful opportunity to tell my story, and one that I'm deeply grateful for. But I also want to recognize the inherent privilege that comes with a platform that values our voices. As lawyers, it should be our mission to find or create pathways to amplify the voices of people who are often not heard and forgotten in society. My story is called "When the Bedbugs Came." My first day of work during my spring externship in Washington, D.C., I looked in the mirror and noticed some mysterious swelling on my forehead. By the next day, several new red bumps appeared on my arm. Mostly as a precaution, I went to the doctor that evening and was told the cryptic lumps were bed bug bites. The next morning, I had to text my supervisor and tell her the room I was renting had bed bugs. This was not the first impression I was hoping for. I missed work and took all of my clothes and started putting them through dryer cycles. My winter coat was a casualty and melted. I walked to a big box store and bought plastic Ziploc bags and bed bug-proof mattress covers. To be quite honest, I bought myself chocolates too. I lamented, how could this happen to me? My first week. I had bites on my face. Going back to work the next day and facing the bed bug sniffing dogs that my office brought in as a precaution was almost too much. I wanted to go home, back to Pittsburgh and my comfortable routine. Law school was a risk. I was 29 years old when I started. It took many years of convincing myself that I was worth the investment of law school and capable of doing the work. In each job I had after college, as a teacher and an advocate for children living in foster care, I served children living in poverty, yet I always wanted to do more. Becoming a lawyer seemed like a dream that I was not yet confident was achievable for me. When accepted to law school, I was both thrilled and apprehensive. My first year was like struggling against a strong current, but I was determined not to give up. The thoughts of my past students and my future potential clients kept me afloat. After fumigation, one of my first assignments was to read cases the organization I was working for litigated to rectify deplorable housing conditions for their clients. I started reading about a young child who literally died from an asthma attack that was caused by poor housing conditions. Another child with disabilities had bullets shot through his bedroom window. I read about a basement apartment that was flooded with sewage and a child who had a ceiling collapse over him. I sat and I read hundreds of cases like these. So many leaks and cockroaches and rodents, apartments with mold and lead and asbestos. In all of these cases, parents and caregivers were desperate for any relief that would make their home safe and habitable for themselves and their children. These individuals were not only facing poor housing conditions, but also poor health. All of this compounded into a system that was unimaginably oppressive. These clients gave all of their confidence to get relief to a lawyer. I read the case notes of all the lawyers who had fought for the dignity of these clients. They wrote letters, they did inspections, they ordered medical files. They sat with clients in their homes and practiced for court. They emailed, they called, they filed motions, they represented their clients zealously. These lawyers, they fought like hell, and sometimes it still wasn't enough. What became clear was that my 3-week stint of bed bug treatments was one of privilege. I practiced my advocacy skills to get the women's dormitory I was living in to pay for an exterminator. I had the means to pay for all of my loads of laundry and the bed bug-proof mattress covers. I knew this was a temporary hassle and that my life was not at risk. I had a safety net and I relied on it. The clients that my externship organization represented were not as fortunate. Should it be privilege that determines if people have a safe environment to live in? Should it be considered lucky for children to grow up in environments that do not make them ill? Due to the downward spiral of poverty, institutional racism, and unaffordable housing, every day children and people die needlessly. Children live in environments that are toxic. Some have even suggested that certain children would have better health outcomes by living in homeless shelters than by continuing to live in housing that is adversely affecting their health, putting their very lives at risk. I have found my resolve renewed in becoming a lawyer. I am continually reminded of my incredible privilege that one day I will be leading clients' cases and making a profound difference in someone's life. In that, I know it will transform my own. Thank you.
Brianna Bell, ladies and gentlemen. Since I heard her story earlier in the day over at the broadcasting building as we were making recordings of these stories, I have not been able to get out of my head an opportunity that my son and I had to travel to Bulgaria and do some humanitarian work some time ago. He's now a grown-up person. He was 14 years old then, and we worked with orphans in orphanages there in Bulgaria. We went to an orphanage filled with teenagers. And a young girl came up to us. She was 13 years old. Her name was Snezhka. I don't speak Bulgarian, but I understand that the word Snezhka means snowy. And she came up to us and she said, "Take my picture. Will you take my picture? Will you take my picture?" So we took picture after picture of Snezhka. And she came to us and looked at the back of our digital camera and flipped through the photos of herself. And then she looked at us and said, "Please don't erase me. Don't erase me." And I think about that experience as I think about the stories that keep alive, some of the things that we need to think about, some of the things that deeply affect us, not just today, but as we keep the stories alive for a long time, forever. And up next, we have Brigham Young University. Look at him there. Look at him there. I mean, who's the whistler? Who's the whistler? Who was that? Nobody's going to raise their hand? It was Kyle! I was about to suspect that it may have been Brandon himself. But ladies and gentlemen, we want to welcome to the microphone Brandon Graves, who said, "To witness that we're capable of having real impact in others' lives and that we can alleviate others' suffering and that by doing so we can also heal ourselves," is his reason for telling you this story today. Ladies and gentlemen, Brandon Graves.
This story is titled Detention and Deep Water. The boat skipped over the small waves on the lake. It was early evening, the sun not quite begun its final descent toward the horizon, and the faintly fragrant smell of desert and the sound of crickets beginning their songs filled the air. I sat at the front of the boat, the bow lifted up high over the water, dipping and rising again in a slow, constant cycle as we made our way toward a far shore. Once we were close, Aaron, the leader of my youth group, idled the boat, and my friends Matt, Emma, and I leaped into the water. We swam the short distance and began to meander around the beach, wandering behind a small hill that obscured our view of the lake. Moments later, we heard the faint sound of a boy's voice. At first, I wondered if I had imagined it, but it came again more clearly. Justin was calling out to us from the water beyond the hill. Justin was about 2 years younger than me, and though I was friendly to him, I found him mildly annoying. Confident that he would follow the sound of our voices and appear around the hill at any moment, we didn't reply and simply continued talking. After a minute or two, we thought it odd that he hadn't shown up. We returned to the water's edge, calling out to him and scanning for any signs of him or the boat. Even though we couldn't find him, we didn't give it much thought, assuming he had simply turned back. When Aaron came back 20 minutes later, he immediately asked where Justin was. Confused, we explained that we had heard Justin call out and had looked for him, but assumed that he had returned to the boat. Panic spread across Aaron's face. Justin never got back on the boat. We frantically made plans. Matt, Emma, and I returned to the shore while Aaron contacted search and rescue. An uneasy feeling filled my stomach, but I still couldn't conceive that something terrible might have happened. Justin was an active member of the high school swim team, and he had even placed in a recent meet. At the worst, I figured he must have twisted an ankle or stumbled off a small cliff while looking for us. We scoured the uneven shore, at every turn expecting to find Justin. Dusk had already fallen and night rapidly approached. Aaron soon rounded us up, sped across the lake, and maneuvered into the dock. We stood in silence under the heavy stars, shaken but still convinced that we'd wake the next morning to the news that Justin had been found, perhaps injured, but okay. News didn't come for 2 days. Finally, I received a call saying that Justin's body had been found at the bottom of the reservoir. After muttering a small thanks, I walked out the back door of my house, folded myself slowly into an armchair, and wept. My mind churned what I could have done differently to prevent Justin's death. I rehearsed countless iterations of alternate realities in which I answered his call, went to the water sooner, stayed at the beach longer. While I had no reason to think that Justin would drown, I couldn't escape the realization that he had called out, I had ignored him, and perhaps if I had simply answered him, he would still be alive. Alone on my back porch, I made myself a promise. I would never again ignore a cry for help. 7 years later, and 2,000 miles away, I met Samir Fayed, an Iraqi asylum seeker detained in a prison in Virginia. Samir called the ABA Commission on Immigration multiple times a week, each time fervently protesting his unjust incarceration until the prison's 30-minute time restraint cut him off, after which he would immediately call back and resume where he left off. It was often impossible to get in a single word. Sometimes Samir shared disturbing experiences. One day he returned to his cell to find his winter clothing shredded. A short time later, after asking for shampoo, a group of prison officers assaulted him, pepper spraying him in the face, beating him and breaking ribs, and placing a mask over his face until he threw up. He was denied medical treatment for weeks following the attack. Similar incidences continued, and his nervousness and volatility increased, even toward us. Samir was trapped in a horrendous cycle of abuse and injustice, and his resilience eventually deteriorated to the point where he verbally attacked a member of my team, accusing them of allying with his prison guards and ICE and not caring if he were deported to Iraq. Despite the mounting difficulty of working with him, I was determined to ensure that his cry for help did not go unheeded. I realized that if I didn't listen, perhaps no one would. After a while, Samir began asking for me when he called. Even if we could do nothing to help him legally, he needed validation, someone beyond the confines of his hard prison walls, to believe him, to comprehend what he was going through, and to offer a hand where possible. I could at least give him that. Only after finishing my internship at the ABA did I fully understand the toxic effect incarceration had had on Samir's personality. My former supervisor posted a video of the newly liberated Samir sitting with him in his office in Washington, D.C. A beaming smile filled his face as he praised God and thanked me and the other interns that had offered him a listening ear, support, and above all, patience through some of his hardest months. The transformation I witnessed in Samir was nothing short of miraculous. Where intense anger, suffering, and defeat had prevailed, gratitude, peace, and healing were restored. Samir was given the chance to tell his story, and quite possibly to save his life, simply because he had people on the shore willing to listen and to act. One of the biggest realizations I've had throughout these years is that while fear, intolerance, and condemnation are obvious enemies of harmony and prosperity, mere self-preoccupation can be equally as dangerous. I think that most people, like me with Justin, have no feelings of ill will, but are often too caught up in the sounding chambers of our own daily interests that we fail to see that we're at the water's edge and there are people calling out. Sometimes it's obvious that someone is drowning and needs aid. Other times, however, we might wonder why they're in the water in the first place or why they can't seem to make it to shore. But until we go to the water's edge, it's impossible to know.
I called Kyle's name earlier, and I know that there were those of you in the room who were thinking, that MC's awesome. He knows the name of everyone in the room. I know that's what you're thinking. It's not true. I will mention something about Kyle and Sherry, and there's our third. We don't have our third, do we? But it's worth note, and it's worth note in front of the LSAC cameras that BYU Law School has awarded a number of storytelling fellowship positions. Storytelling fellowships. These guys are storytelling fellows. There they are. If that doesn't deserve some applause, I mean, who'd have thought? Up next, we have someone who talks about the reason why she tells stories, the reason why she wants to tell this story today, as the simple reason I want to show the impact that one person can have on people's lives. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the microphone, Isabella Martinez.
My story is making a difference, not just a living. It was a hot summer day as I stand in front of Mr. Jones's office. I break into sweat, my heart is pounding, and my hands start shaking as I open the door. This is my first interaction with an attorney. I know I'm not in trouble, I only needed help. His secretary greets me and takes me into the conference room. It's a pretty simple office. The wall needs to be repainted. Nothing like you see on TV. After a couple minutes, Mr. Jones walks in. He tells me this will be a quick and straightforward process. A month later, I received a copy of the petition. Page 1, my name is misspelled. Page 3, wrong address. The mistakes continue as I read the stack of papers. I call Mr. Jones's office, and they assure me that the mistakes will be fixed. 2 months go by, no progress. 8 months, they won't even return my phone calls. Desperate to know the status of my case, I reach out to my friend Google. Google teaches me how to see the status of a case. It is said to be dismissed for want of prosecution. The court says my case is being thrown out. I drive to Mr. Jones's office knowing this is the only way I'm going to get a quick response. Mr. Jones tells me I must be misinformed. I print out the docket information and send it to him. Now do you believe me? Or do I have to show up to court tomorrow because it seems you don't have any interest in my case? All I hear in his voice is indifference. After this experience, I hoped I would never interact with another attorney again. I would soon find out it was an attorney who would help me through the hardest time of my life. One evening, while working on my college applications, I received a phone call from a Border Patrol agent. My mom has been detained. She was driving on 2 rims and she was disoriented. Is she on drugs, he asks. No, of course not. I quickly arrange for somebody to pick her up and take her to the hospital. I pack a suitcase and board the next flight to McAllen, Texas. By the time I arrive at the hospital, my mom's unresponsive and her heart rate is quickly falling. 60, 50, 40. The medical staff panics. It's chaotic. There's a neurologist, an infectious disease doctor, a brain surgeon, and several nurses taking care of her. But none of them can tell me what's wrong with her. As one doctor tries to bring up her heart rate, the other discuss the possibility of brain surgery. She is intubated. I prepare for the worst. 36, 34, 32. Finally, her heart rate stops decreasing. As the medical staff leaves the room, I clear my throat and I ask, will she make it overnight? They don't know. I can't hold back my pain and tears start falling down my cheeks. Will I be able to tell her I love you one more time? I am sad, angry, remorseful, and full of doubt. I would give up anything just to laugh with her one more time. 2 weeks later, we finally get a diagnosis. A virus attacked her brain. A virus that is dormant in our bodies if we have ever had the chicken pox. But why her? The worst that had happened to her was a car accident 3 weeks ago. She was a healthy woman. After several weeks, she regains consciousness. She cannot talk or walk and has memory problems. She won't be able to work for a very long time, but the bills keep piling up. Before her hospitalization, my mom had contacted an attorney, Ray, to help her with her car accident. After not hearing from her, Ray's office contacted me. I explained the situation and offered to help in any way I can. Ray is nothing like the first attorney. He shows genuine care and concern for my family. Knowing my situation, Ray offers me a part-time job with all the time off I need to take care of my mom. I accepted. His generosity and willingness to help did not end with me, but continued with each and every one of his clients. Ray showed me the impact that one person can have in other people's lives. A young woman once came into the office. She was expelled from school 2 weeks before graduation for being repeatedly late. She was a single mother of 7, had no money, and lived in a 3-bedroom house with 17 other people. Her car broke down regularly, and often she would walk to school in over 100-degree weather. It was a hard case, but Ray helped her at no cost. He won the case, and she has now graduated as a nursing assistant. Feeling unimportant, and feeling like a paycheck to someone is not only felt by me, but by countless many people. I met a man who lost his house due to inadequate representation, and I met many injured clients whose attorneys stole money from their settlement checks. Many have forgotten the responsibilities that one has by being called an attorney. Becoming an attorney means much more than driving a fancy car or gaining respect simply by the title that you hold. Becoming an attorney means fighting for the justice and the fair representation of all.
Isabella Martinez, ladies and gentlemen. You know, up next, when we were over at BYU Broadcasting, I had to introduce Sean O'Neill to Sean O'Neill. Sean O'Neill is the assistant head of BYU Radio over there, and they share the same name. And while we were over here, Sean said, "Well, what's Sean's middle name?" Because I said, "I hope we get a chance to introduce you over there to Sean O'Neill." And Sean said, "What's his middle name?" "It's probably some Irish middle name like mine, which is Patrick." And we went over that. I didn't know what our Sean O'Neill's middle name was. It turns out it's Michael. So Sean Patrick O'Neill and Sean Michael O'Neill had a little moment together. I want to introduce you to Sean O'Neill just by pointing out the fun fact. Sean O'Neill learned to surf poorly while living in Ireland and Los Angeles, learned to ski mediocrely in his hometown in Buffalo, New York, and learned how to row boats passably at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass. He enjoys these and other outdoor activities in Washington, D.C. When we asked him to give us a reason for his storytelling, he said, and I think it's so beautiful to the face of what that fun fact says, he says, "Difficult though it is, there is comfort in confronting my own inadequacy." So let's bring to the microphone the poor skier, or the poor surfer, the mediocre skier, and the passable rower. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean Patrick O'Neill.
My story is called The Outdoor Court of Law. I suck at basketball. This is not immediately clear from looking at me. I realize as I survey the members of the grand jury. It is mid-morning. I just stated my name for the record, and my reusable coffee mug rests under the witness stand and barely out of sight. Caffeine and nerves coalesce. I begin sweating in my navy blue suit, envious of the grand jurors wearing t-shirts. My attention is wrenched back to the prosecutor. "Mr. O'Neill, do you occasionally play basketball in the District of Columbia?" I've got to remember that line, I think, knowing the laughter it will elicit from my 1L buddies who occasionally play basketball much better than I do. "Yes," I answer. The prosecutor continues, asking me to draw X's and O's on an aerial photo of a basketball court. Not some complicated offensive formation, but the precise location of the crime in question. The summer before law school, my friend and I witnessed an assault while playing pickup at our neighborhood court. An indigent man who had been watching our game got into an altercation with another man who happened by. After the second man ran off, seemingly uninjured, we decided to play on. 20 minutes later, a police officer stopped us, and my friend and I stepped into separate squad cars to recount our versions of what happened. "Do you think you can ID the assailant?" one of the cops asked. I nodded. We drove 2 blocks, and I saw a man handcuffed in the street, looking defeated, but staring directly at me through the tinted cruiser windows. "Him?" "Yep." Alarmingly, my house was only a block away. The police dropped me off like an Uber would at the corner. Halfway out the door, I began to backtrack. Listen, I'm going to be in Alaska for a week this summer, I started. The cop laughed. You won't hear from us for at least 6 months. 6 months later, I'm finishing my first semester of law school. Idle Saturdays spent playing basketball have been replaced with long hours reading cryptic portions of the Uniform Commercial Code. Even the character of my to-do list has changed. Once filled with must explore local hikes and coffee shops, they're now crammed with daunting tasks like find summer job, outline for torts. Friday afternoons provided one of the few respites during those stressful months. A group of my classmates and I would temporarily shelve our casebooks and walk to the gym to play basketball. Our giddiness was palpable each time we gathered lemming-like in the lobby. Leaving the law school during daylight hours felt sacrilegious, but doing it en masse felt like justified rebellion. As a high school hockey player and a bad skier, basketball's fundamentals had long eluded me, yet I became a zealous advocate of these weekly games. Towards the end of that first semester, I came home to find a letter bearing the return address of the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. I had recently applied to a federal job in DC, and I couldn't contain my excitement while tearing it open. Mr. O'Neill, you have been subpoenaed to testify about the events you witnessed in July of 2018. Alas, find summer job remained on my to-do list. The prosecutor generously waited until exams were over to schedule my testimony. I arrived at court dressed for a job interview, thinking all the while, I hope this turns into a job interview. The prosecutor briefed me on what would happen in the grand jury proceedings, and eventually I blurted out, "Why are you prosecuting this man? I mean, it seemed like he was homeless, possibly under the influence. What good will this do?" The prosecutor looked up from her legal pad, her face drawn. The victim was hurt, badly. He's testifying too. It will probably end with a plea deal and a lesser charge, but this was a violent assault. I nodded. My simplified theories of social justice were untested in such murky legal waters. My criminal law professor told me I could just refuse to take the stand. Let them try to enforce the subpoena, she suggested. I felt frustrated with my lack of autonomy, but I can only imagine the feelings of the victim and the assailant, both intertwined in the criminal justice system where they were overrepresented demographically and underrepresented by attorneys. Whatever role I will eventually play as a lawyer, as a witness, I was a cog in a mechanism I won't soon understand. I'm an admitted extrovert, but I've often found that it's the 15 minutes spent warming up alone that I enjoy the most about our law school basketball games. A law student's day has its rhythms: reading and briefing cases, going to class, journal assignments, but I find none so calming as the gleaming gymnasium floor, the squeak of sneakers, and the staccato swish of net strings when the rare shot makes it in. Difficult though it is, there is comfort in confronting my own inadequacy. Thanks.
Sean Patrick O'Neill. Now, up next, we have Lily Shue. I'm glad that her fun fact states what her favorite legal opinion is. This is a place where people have favorite legal opinions. It's a little outside my comfort zone, frankly, but when I learned about this, I looked it up. I looked up that legal opinion, and it's the legal opinion that's written, partly at least, in anapestic tetrameter, the poetic mode favored by Dr. Seuss. So if she wants to recite, she may. I will not, but we do want to welcome to the microphone Lily Shue.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. I will refrain from reciting poetry, but I will share this story with you. Oh. Just leave it? Okay. My story is called Dante and the Changing Room. I don't think about Dante very often anymore. As an evening law student working in a legal office, my thoughts are consumed by what I imagine preoccupies most law students' minds. But in 2017, I used to think about Dante every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m., between scarfing down my packed lunch and trying to cram for my first semester contracts class. I did this eating, cramming, and thinking about what to do with Dante during our upcoming 1 p.m. therapy session, all while hiding inside a changing room from the masses of rowdy middle and high school students traversing the hallways. It was a nice changing room. I think perhaps it was not designed to be a changing room at all. But on the first day of my job as a speech-language pathologist for the District of Columbia Public Schools, I was assigned to room 509, and after many wrong turns, found my way to a door along a forgotten-looking hallway with a small brown sign that read, "Changing Room, 509." The room had 3 raised seating tiers that were painted gray, and a mirror spanned half a wall. It would have been a great place to rehearse plays in. It was a horrible place to provide speech therapy. The mirror was distracting, and the seating tiers provided the perfect temptation for bored students to climb on. Dante's real name wasn't Dante. I learned this when I called the name on my roster, looking to take him for his first speech therapy session. Dante got mad at me for using that name, and he refused to come. His teacher yelled at him, but at 17 years old and 6'2", no one was going to force Dante to come to therapy if he didn't want to. When he refused, I was relieved. That meant that I could go back to my lunch and maybe cram in a few more minutes of studying for contracts. After school let out for my students, I started walking down New Hampshire Avenue towards my own law school classes. Sitting in contracts, sometimes my attention would wander, and I would marvel at the differences between working in the DC public schools during the day and attending law school in DC. My days had become black, and my nights had become white. Race, culture, education, everything seemed to belong to 2 different worlds that I flitted back and forth between daily. The next time I went to get Dante, I was successful. But over the next few sessions, I still struggled to get him to participate. By late fall, I thought that Dante was comfortable enough with me to start planning what activities I could do with him that would challenge him more. I turned to a favorite low-budget activity, origami. I envisioned that I would have Dante read a story about fortune cookies, and following that, we would do an origami activity in which he would create a fortune teller. I thought it was perfect. I could target reading comprehension, conversational skills, and even cultural awareness. When Dante and I arrived at my changing room, he took a seat across from me, my bulky gray desk buffering the space between us. I slid the fortune cookie story across and asked Dante to read it. Dante crossed his arms over his chest. I tried again. Dante, I'd like you to just read the first line. He slowly uncrossed his arms. 3 words in, I learned that Dante could barely read, but he continued to try through the end of the sentence. I quickly decided to scrap the story idea and moved on to the origami activity. The session progressed slowly, but nearing the end, Dante had read several lines of instructions and created a fortune teller. Once done, Dante stood up abruptly. With his fortune teller in one hand, he turned towards the door and hesitated. Turning back and not looking at me, he nonchalantly reached out towards the instruction sheets between us. Dante took the sheet and very carefully folded it into quarters to put into his pocket. There was no breakthrough, no sudden understanding between us, but it was a victory. I had tried to engage Dante to help him succeed in school, and he had shown me in some small way that he was interested. "Dante," I said, "would you like to take the instructions home with you?" He met my eyes briefly, but didn't respond. I tried again. "You can ask, 'Miss Shue, can I take the instructions?'" Still looking down, he repeated, "Miss Shue, can I take the instructions?" I responded, "Yes. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'll see you next week." I didn't see Dante next week. I quit my job and I started a new job on the Hill. When I think about Dante, I think about my choice to study law, and sometimes I feel guilty for leaving the schools. There, I felt like I was helping people. In law school, I feel like I am trying to win. After switching jobs, it became so easy to get caught up in a world that places so much emphasis on winning. I think about whether I should participate in my journal's editorial board competition. I wonder if my GPA will be high enough to make an honors designation. So I don't think about Dante very often. But it is in these moments that I think I most need to recall my short time with him. Because when I think of Dante, I am reminded that the desire to win is fine, but it must always be tempered by a reason. In the practice of law, winning is just a proxy for saying that you helped someone accomplish a goal. When I worked in the DC public schools and attended law school during the nights, the contrast seems so different to me. Now, when I do think of Dante, I think maybe the differences were leading to the same place. I am reminded that being a law student is about learning how to help others solve their problems. When I was in the schools, I was helping Dante and students like him solve their problems. To do that, you need to win, but winning does not mean being declared a victor. Winning is Dante reaching out across a desk for a sheet of instructions. Winning is helping other people get closer to their goals. I hope that in this new career I have chosen, I will never forget the lessons that Dante and the changing room have taught me. Thank you.
Lily Shue, ladies and gentlemen. Now up next, we have Clarissa Cashmore, who is not now, but was a student here at BYU, but not in the law department. You were a harp major? Yeah, playing the harp. And there she is. When we asked her for her storytelling reason, she said, "There is value in remembering our weaknesses and strengths juxtaposed." She said, this beautiful thing, awkward compassion is still compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the microphone, Clarissa Cashmore.
"I'm here for a divorce," the woman mumbled. Her discomfort was obvious as she lowered herself gingerly into the worn chair, then waited expectantly. My stomach nodded. Equipped with 1 semester of woefully irrelevant law classes, I felt like a child, tongue-tied, and inadequate to offer legal assistance of any variety. My partner, a chipper second-year student, began the interview. There we sat in crisp blouses and slacks, our young faces exuding the optimism and security that accompany comfortable, nurturing upbringings in which one learns that dreams are mere forerunners to an obtainable future. In sharp contrast, the woman before us seemed stooped from clawing her way up the slope, only to slip backwards. Her pallid face showed little emotion apart from bone-deep weariness, but I could sense her resolve as she responded to our preliminary questions and gave a matter-of-fact accounting of the marriage she sought to end. The happy beginning, the suffocating abuse, the calculated flight. "That was brave of you," my partner remarked. "No," the woman countered, "just had to get out, you know?" I didn't know, but I nodded. Haltingly, we began the paperwork for an absolute divorce that waived all rights to alimony and equitable distribution. Eyeing the complaint, I reiterated that she was asking for and would likely receive nothing. The woman affirmed decisively. Next, I asked, "Would you like to change your name back to your maiden name?" Sitting taller, the woman answered, "Yes, please. I want to use my daddy's name again. He was a good man." After filling in the blanks, we read the body of the complaint back as she checked the inserted information for accuracy. Plaintiff respectfully requests that the bonds of matrimony which have existed between the parties be dissolved. Sounds real official, the woman responded approvingly. After working our way through the forms, I ran to the printers, grabbed the papers as they sputtered out, and wove back through the plastic tables and roving attorneys. The woman seemed more relaxed, though she stiffened as I placed the forms in front of her. Shoulders hunched, brows furrowed, the woman studied the documents. "I'm ready," she announced as she studied the last one. My partner scurried off to find our supervisors. I made fumbling efforts at small talk. I listened intently as the woman's responses bloomed into a story about her parents, her first marriage right out of high school, and how she ended up in that small town far from her childhood home. Remembering that she had children, I asked her more about them. There was a long pause, and then a blunt, "Can we not talk anymore?" I flushed. "Of course, we can sit here quietly," I responded, inwardly kicking myself. The woman kept her eyes fixed on her knees as the minutes ticked by. "I haven't seen my kids in a long time," the woman offered unexpectedly. "A real long time." I'm sorry," I stammered uncertainly. The woman nodded, accepting my apology. Lapsing back into a more comfortable silence, we waited. My partner returned, flanked by the notary and a supervising attorney. With steady hands, the woman signed every form, observing somberly as each stamp validated her signature. The woman listened carefully to next step instructions, then stood up to leave. I wanted to hug this woman, to give words of hope, comfort, but professionalism and awareness that I could do nothing further for her reined sentiment into a handshake. Returning the gentle pressure, the woman said, "You girls are real nice. Thanks for your help." We wished her the best as she exited, head held ever so slightly higher than when she entered. I felt strangely deflated as the woman disappeared from sight, thinking of all that she had left to do. I pondered the interaction in a much quieter courtroom, the bustle of the morning having slowed to a trickle. Hearing the complaints of the students at the lack of visitors, I wondered, was our paltry contribution for us or for them? One view seemed selfish, the other condescending. We came to learn our trade, to bolster our resume, to have stories to tell. Or perhaps we came to give much-needed legal assistance, to share valuable skills, to listen actively, or both. Many in that small town saw the law as a web of formalities that created an expensive barrier to resolution, and attorneys as proponents of that barrier. Were we building a bridge to a long-awaited determination, or were we simply perpetuating a system that penalized self-representation? Over a year later, these questions are unresolved. I have since met clients who eye us mistrustfully, unsure of what we can offer, if we will be sympathetic, or even believe them. At times, I feel overwhelmed at the volume of assistance needed compared to the meager portion I am authorized to give. Yet, despite my limitations, or perhaps because of them, I have come to recognize the value of imperfect advocacy. Advocacy is, in its most basic form, support. Advocates bridge the gap between the austerity of the theoretical law and the highly personal reality of its application. Advocates are champions of a cause. Imperfect advocacy is limited in scope but sincere, deriving success through furnishing knowledge, skills, or resources previously unavailable to the client. When multiplied, these efforts broaden the understanding about how to navigate the legal system, validate decisions through legally enforceable documents, and shift perceptions of the legal field. Through imperfect advocacy, barriers become bridges.
Clarissa Cashmore, ladies and gentlemen. You know, as we've spent time today together, getting to know these stories, getting to know each other, getting to know some of the experiences, some of the life experiences that have driven some of these stories, me and my colleagues have all, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, been really rocked. And we have sort of been rocked back on our heels thinking to ourselves, and you, after all that, look at you. You are a law student in a prestigious American university. What a testament to your fortitude and your determination and your resourcefulness. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to bring one more storyteller to the stage tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, bring to the microphone Mara Kazama.
Thank you. Before I present my story, I would like to thank BYU for presenting us with this opportunity. It is such a privilege to get to meet so many amazing people and hear all of those inspiring stories. The title of my story is Guardian Angel. Poor little thing. She'll probably end up in a psychiatric hospital for the rest of her life. Our neighbor whispered to my grandmother as they both sympathetically eyed me during my parents' funeral. I had been sitting in the same seat for over an hour, fidgeting my hands in my lap in an effort to distract myself from the whispering voices around me. "Do you think she's in denial?" asked another. As I began to feel cramps in the back of my neck, I looked up, only to see that in a room full of people, everyone was staring at me. I was 11 years old at the time, just starting middle school, and had been living a normal life until August 9th, 2009. The day before was just like every other Saturday. My parents took me and my two younger brothers to have breakfast at a French bakery nearby our house. We had our usual of fresh chocolate croissants, buttered baguettes, and omelets on the side. The only thing out of the norm that morning, was that my dad seemed very stressed. After breakfast, everyone except my dad went back home. My brothers played on their PlayStation as I sat across from them, doodling on Microsoft Paint. Later that night, my brothers fell asleep in my parents' bed, and I walked lightly to my bedroom. My dad did not return home until after we slept. It was at 4 a.m. when I woke up to a blasting sound which my ears only recognized from movies. I could almost feel our house vibrating. Gunshots. It was gunshots. I could hear my mom struggling to breathe as she screamed, "Please stop." I could not hear anybody else. Realizing that every member of my family was in my parents' bedroom, I reacted without thinking and ran towards the sound, towards their room. My knees were trembling, barely carrying me down the hall. Relief flooded into me when I reached the end of the hall and I saw my dad standing with a gun in his hand. Whoever got inside our house, he got them. We were safe. At least that is what I thought right before I felt an intolerable pain right above my chest, accompanied by the same blast I had heard earlier. I looked down and I felt nauseous as I saw a big circle of blood on my pajama shirt. My mind refused to believe that it was my dad who fired the gun. For 11 years, all I ever saw in my father was kindness, strength, empathy, intelligence, and inspiration. But that was not enough to overcome his history with mental illness. I realized that even the strongest people can hit rock bottom, and it can truly destroy them, or in my dad's case, kill him. In a blink of an eye, I had lost everything and every single member of my family, including my father, who could not take what he had done and decided to take his own life. All I was left with were bullet wounds to remind me of the tragedy. A tragedy that has intertwined with hardship to sculpt the person I am today. Physical recovery was not easy, but it was certainly easier than emotional recovery. Right after I recovered, police officers were among my first visitors, followed by investigators and eventually nosy media reporters. I was asked to attend court on multiple occasions, stand in front of different panels, repeating the same details over and over again. I was the victim, yet I was treated like a witness in a cross-examination. I recall in a statement by Justice John Marshall Harlan, Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He mentioned that the Constitution of the U.S. was colorblind. Similarly, in Jordan, the Constitution was also blind. Not colorblind, but completely blind. Blind to the loopholes in laws, blind to the neglections of rights, blind to the sorry. I'm sorry, I just forgot to mention a detail here. Right after the incident, according to Jordanian law, when parents pass away and a child is left behind, guardianship would go to the paternal grandfather, while custody would go to the maternal grandmother. That was the beginning of a series of odd laws which I encountered and under which I was victim once again. Justice John Marshall Harlan mentioned that the U.S. Constitution is colorblind. And similarly in Jordan, the Constitution was also blind. And it was blind to all the loopholes in laws that served guardians with so much power that they can take away the rights of minors. Right then, I had discovered my passion for law, and I had discovered that I can make the change. Even though it might not be what I want it to be, and even though the law and the Constitution is not the best, we can do the changes. We can be the change. And I discovered that minors in situations similar to mine not only had guardians, but they had guardian angels. And I decided to make that change and to walk that path along my guardian angel. It was the law. Thank you.
Far be it from me to turn what is actually kind of an august occasion into a hootenanny by strapping a guitar on. But we'll wrap up. I hope to share this with my storytelling friends with whom we've been working today. This event used to be held at The Wall, which is a venue here on campus that's sort of part restaurant, part comedy club. And what a blessing, what an honor it is to tell these stories in a place designed to approximate the place in the careers, the future careers of these students, where they will bring their compassion and their bravery and the things that they've learned and the things they've immortalized in these stories. This is a song about storytelling, and it was written after an interview with the astronaut Jerry Linenger. Jerry Linenger, in 1993, spent 5 months aboard the space station Mir. That space station caught fire while he was aboard it, and as he rushed with the Russian cosmonauts with whom he shared that space in to put out the fire, he found himself shouting, "I'm sorry, John." He didn't know at first why he had shouted that, but John was his 2-year-old son back on Earth. And he shouted, "I'm sorry, John," because he knew that he was going to die in that fire and that he wouldn't be able to share with his son the things that he had learned and the things that he believed and the things that he loved. Well, he survived the fire and came home and was able to share those stories with his son. And even before he came home, he resolved every day to write his son a letter from aboard the space station Mir. This wasn't the International Space Station. This was the old Russian space station Mir. Your cell phone has more technological power than the space station Mir had. But he came home, and that boy survived on those stories that his father was, in fact, able to tell him. There's something in your eyes, something that you'd tell me if you could, something you'd help me see. There's something in your eyes, something that you see in me for good, like you're watching out for me. There's something in your face, pointing to a future bright and fair, like if I look, I'll see it too. There's something in your face, like there is a treasure waiting there. When I turn around and reach for you, but you left a story. It's gonna light my way. I feel you around me, like the sand around a shore. And I'm gonna find you like it's the dark of night, and every story is one of a million stars. There's something in my heart, something like a promise I can keep. And now I see there's something in my heart, something strong and steady, something deep, feels like family. And I'll rise up and I'll turn my heart to you. I'll turn my heart to you like you turned to me. And you left a story, it's gonna light my way. I feel you around me like the sand around a shore. And I'm gonna find you, and we'll bring each other home. And every story is one of a million stars. Oh, every story is one of a million stars. It's probably appropriate that over the strumming of the guitar, we announce that there's a little reception after the show with refreshments and everything. Thanks to the program, Law Stories, and thanks to the leadership of the Law Department, and thanks to you, our friends from all over the country who have joined us to share your stories here in this place with us tonight.